Nintendo!
Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Chrono, and today we'll be covering the Amalgamation Chamber and the new Aberrus raid on Heroic and Mythic difficulties. This fight involves two targets that eventually merge into one. Reminder that everything seen here is from PTR testing, so anything can still change between now and release. Let's get into it. There are two elementals, each with similar abilities. One is shadow themed, and the other is fire. So long as they're too close to one another, the raid takes triple damage from all sources. On top of this, each boss periodically applies a stacking debuff to all players within 50 yards. So you'll want to separate them far enough so that the melee aren't getting both stacks at once. The fire debuff does ticking damage every second, while the shadow debuff ticks every 5 seconds for a larger amount per tick while also lowering your max HP. Flame Slash and Shadow Spike are the tank mechanics that each hit for a light amount of damage, and by themselves aren't that big of a threat. Tanks mainly have to be concerned with how much damage they're taking in from high stacks. Coalescing Void spawns a vortex near the Shadow ad that slowly pulls all nearby players in, and explodes for fall-off damage. Umbral Detonation targets a handful of players with a circle, which drops a puddle that lasts for the rest of Phase 1. Shadow's Convergence spawns orbs in a circular formation at a fixed distance from the Shadow ad, and these move in towards the boss. It is possible for these to spawn right on top of you, and do damage within 1 second of appearing, so be wary of this. Fiery Meteor forms a large circle that must be soaked. This does split damage to everyone inside. Molten Eruption lobs a handful of fireballs nearby, indicated by smaller circles that need to be soaked. Missing any of these will do a high amount of damage to the entire raid. Swirling Flame causes the fire ad to face a random player, and then fires off projectiles that travel the entire distance of the room, knocking back anybody that gets hit. When either ad hits 50%, Phase 2 begins, where both ads combine the remaining HP to form the Shadow Flame Amalgamation. Instead of applying separate shadow and fire debuffs, the raid will now gain stacks of Shadow Flame Contamination every 10 seconds for the remainder of the fight, which lowers your max health and does ramping rot damage. The boss gains a new tank mechanic called Writhing Vulnerability that does high physical damage and increases all magic damage taken. Tanks should also be careful about where they point the boss, as it now does a frontal. Gloom Conflag has two parts to it. Help soak the big circle, and as soon as it explodes, you have about 5 seconds to move out before a second explosion occurs that does fall-off damage. Blistering Twilight picks random players with a circle, which causes twisters to fly outward, as well as leave a puddle on the floor for the rest of the fight. Convergent Eruption spawns several smaller circles that need to be soaked, and shortly after the impact, a set of orbs will close in at each location. We started testing this boss by seeing if it was possible to brute force it, with the ads stacked on top of each other. Even though we managed to push one ad in a reasonable amount of time, the 200% damage buff that the bosses had persisted, and the ticking damage annihilated us before we could confirm how long it lasted, or if it falls off at all. Because of this, I have some bad news for melee players. You'll be doing a lot of running back and forth if your raid's DPS isn't high enough. It takes 20 seconds for your current stacking debuff to fall off. So if you don't think you can push to Phase 2 before it becomes lethal, you'll be forced to run to the other boss to avoid gaining more stacks. The ranged can hang out in the middle for the most part, and even though you're gaining both stacks at once, if you ever feel like you're in danger, it's easy to move a short distance to outrange either ad. During testing, it was fairly easy for us to push the boss before its stacks got anywhere close to dangerous, so as long as you crank the damage, you may not have to move much, if at all. During Phase 2, make sure you're dropping puddles away from the middle, as well as spread from each other so you don't immediately get murdered by the twisters. The mechanics here are all combinations of ones you've already seen in Phase 1, so as long as you manage your space well and stay on top of soaks, this boss shouldn't be that much of a hurdle. On Mythic, the Shadow and Fire debuffs are now permanent and do not expire passively. To clear them, you need to make contact with someone that has at least one stack of the opposite debuff. Clearing stacks causes an explosion in a small radius, as well as leaving a new, lingering debuff that also does ticking damage. It's worth noting that it's still possible to be gaining both Shadow and Fire debuffs at the same time without triggering an explosion on yourself. 2 players standing in the middle of the room, soaking both stacks, can clear both debuffs at once by running into each other. Whenever you clear either set of stacks, the Mythic only debuff amplifies damage taken for the element that you just cleared. For example, if I currently have stacks of the Shadow debuff and I run into someone on the Fire side to clear it, Lingering Shadows causes me to take extra shadow damage for the next 20 seconds. This encourages you to swap sides after clearing. It's recommended that you have a designated partner to clear with so that everyone has control over how much damage they're taking. If you recently cleared your stacks and are waiting for your current lingering stacks to fall off, and someone runs into you again, it'll not only refresh the duration, but it also adds onto your current stack count. So you can't just clear with someone just because they're near you, and it's convenient timing for you, as you may end up killing someone. For the range standing in the middle of the room, we found it ideal to try to stay below 10 stacks of either type, so it was good to just immediately clear after your lingering debuffs fall off. We used double prop pally tanks during testing, and they were able to immune off their stacks. But I wouldn't be surprised if they blacklist these debuffs for immunities. During Phase 2, the boss gains a new ability called Shadow and Flame, which applies the stacking debuffs from Phase 1 onto a large number of random players, forcing people to clear stacks and continue dealing with lingering debuffs. This makes it so that you can potentially have up to 3 separate instances of ticking debuffs on you at any given time. Overall, I thought this fight was pretty fun, but I'd imagine this could be annoying as a melee player. For bosses like this, I'd almost rather see them have a mechanic that causes the adds to swap sides rather than have the melee players run clear across the room repeatedly. One idea could be that the bosses attempt to cast a teleport that can be interrupted, and when you feel like it's a good time to clear stacks for the melee, just let one go through and have the adds swap sides. Aside from that, the fight felt good for being one of the earlier encounters. Thanks for dropping by for another boss guide. I hope you found it helpful. As I finish the rest of the Aberrus videos, I'll be adding them onto a playlist, so be sure to check that out in the description below. I wish you the best of luck in the raid. I'll see you next time.